Hi folks, Canadian Prepper here. Time is of the essence, yours is valuable, so let's just jump right to it, skip all the BS. Now, I gotta say, towards the latter half of this video, I am going to be discussing something which is a bit more controversial, and it pertains to one of the few things as a prepper that keeps me up at night. There's not many things that keep me up at night because as preppers, we're prepared for everything, so it really doesn't matter to us if the shit gets a fizzy tomorrow. Should to other people, but it doesn't to us, contrary to popular belief. So stick around for that. Now let's just jump right into it. So, Russia warns Ukraine that it might strike Kiev, the capital, if they continue to make incursions upon Russian territory. Now, why are they saying this? And of course, this might sound quite hypocritical to some people who just entered the conversation. But basically, they are concerned that the Ukrainians have been making some attacks and incursions and cyber attacks and threats towards the Russians. Now, you might say to yourself, well, duh, they're at war. What they're saying is significant, however. The Russian military said it could target decision makers in Kiev if Ukraine continues attempting attacks on Russian soil. Everything in quotes here, guys, okay? Now, this validates what we've been saying all along. If this is all true, if we take this at face value, that they are making a conscious effort to avoid taking out decision makers in Kiev. Who's the decision maker in Kiev? Okay, well, there's one in particular I can think of. Moscow has so far refrained from attacking Ukrainian decision makers, but if Kiev continues attempting to carry out acts of sabotage or conventional attacks within Russia, this will change, the Russian Defense Ministry warned on Wednesday. Now, there may be more going on there than we know. You know, this helicopter attack on the fuel depot, that may but be one thing. Now, the Ukrainians have denied doing that, so it's really hard to say, you know, was it a false flag that the Russians did? Who knows? But what we do know in this next story that I'm going to talk about is very important, so stick with me, is that there is potentially weapons coming to Ukraine, which could be used in an offensive manner to project force from long distances, and that's going to be very significant. We have seen attempts at sabotage and attacks by the Ukrainian military against facilities in the Russian territory. If attempts continue, the Russian Federation's armed forces will strike at the decision-making centers, including Kiev, something we have so far refrained from, explained spokesman Major General Igor Konashenkov. While Konashenkov did not specify which strikes or attempts at sabotage he was referring to on Monday, Russia declared a heightened terrorism alert in 3 regions bordering Ukraine, Bryansk, Kursk, and Belgorod, and several border municipalities in the regions of Krasnodar, Voronezh, and Crimea. So, things are heating up. Now, why is this so important? This is so important because there is some speculation, and this is from a Turkish news source, so take it all with a grain of salt. Turkey's kind of 50-50 on these things. That the Biden government is potentially considering sending some heavy weapons to Ukraine, among other countries. These heavy weapons will have the capability to strike within Russia. This may include things like Reaper drones, Predator drones. What else? Heavy artillery drones, Humvees, coastal defense systems, CBRN uniforms for protection against chemical, nuclear, biological attacks. Well, we already know that's been sent a long time ago, and that's, you know, the defensive thing anyways. But they're concerned that in light of the problems or the challenges that the Russians have faced with these Turkish drones, they're concerned that the Ukrainians are going to be gifted these items, or not gifted, I don't know if they're going to IOUs or what, but they're going to be given these weapons which are going to be able to target places within Russia. Now, this is problematic for numerous reasons. As we've always said, yes, it would be great if Ukrainians could take back their country and everything would go back to normal. Unfortunately, the Russians view the Ukraine, they call it, I think it refers to the front or something, because they believe it's basically the front door into their country. It's a huge flank, okay? It's their eastern flank, western flank. So to them, it's very important, it's critical, and it's existential that they basically have some sort of dominion within this region. And if they don't, it means that they get to play the nuclear card. Now, how this would likely escalate is if they started to feel backed into a corner, you're going to start to see more strikes on Kiev. That's when I would be worried. I would be worried if they started targeting the capital more. Now, like I said, this validates for us what we've been saying all along, that they have been refraining from you playing that card, because we know that they've been showing restraint. They could cut the power easily, take out a few transformers, all the power is gone to these major cities. No problem. They haven't done that for obvious reasons. There's reasons. I don't know those reasons. You don't know those reasons. We can speculate, but nobody knows. Only the Russians know what their long game strategy is. If they do start striking capital cities, or cities in general, other cities, then you know that potentially they are starting to, whatever strategies they're trying to employ in the east may not be working out that well, which I can't see happening at this point. It's going to be more protracted than people think. I think that the impression that they would have gone in there in 3 days to get this done, that has kind of primed people to this idea that war should just be a quick one and done thing, and you can just mobilize 1 million troops at the drop of a hat. And things just don't work this way. This is not a video game. Okay, this is real life, and I always gave the Ukrainians far more credit. And even an intelligence officer that I spoke to prior to this whole thing starting, he thought that they would be taken out relatively quicker. He thought about a month, and I thought that they would put up much more of a fight. And I guess I was right about that. But he also provided some good insights as well, so no shade on him. But I will say that it would be concerning if they started shelling the big cities, and then of course, if that didn't work, then and if the Ukrainians started targeting Russia, then of course you have the potential for them to let a nuke fly or something to that effect. Now, we also have the Finnish and Swedish who are wanting to expedite their entry into NATO. This is scary also, because the more of these things that happen, the more backed into a corner Russia may feel. If they feel backed into a corner, like I say, I don't know what's going on there. I don't know if they're doing better or worse as a result of this. I mean, we can all speculate. What we do know is that the majority of the population is now mobilized for full-scale war. I have an article about that too that I will share. But this is potentially dangerous territory we're entering if the USA starts to sense that maybe they're going to be using some chemical weapons or something like that, so they feel they have to send heavier weapons. Then Russia ups the ante a bit by attacking a capital city. Ukraine starts to feel like under existential threat, so they start targeting a Russian city, which wouldn't make much sense to me, because that would really bring the full force of the Russian military to bear. So it's not looking good either way, guys. And this thing is going to escalate, but it's not going to happen overnight. And anybody who has been preparing up until this point, I'm pretty sure, I don't want to say that you're going to have the last laugh, because nobody's going to be laughing if the shit hits a fan, but I feel that we will all be vindicated soon, put it that way, and not in a way we want to be vindicated, because, as preppers, we're prepped for the zombie apocalypse, but most of us aren't prepped for a nuclear war. Now, Russian soldiers in Ukraine have now been ordered to use all of their lethal force against the Ukrainian forces. And I don't have the first part of this article here. I can't remember who said. Some Russian official said that. In this phase, the gloves are coming off. And this is a translation, so it's kind of weird. It's from that same Turkish website. In the second phase of the Russian operation in Ukraine, the mistakes made in the first have been taken into account. And I think the bulk of their miscalculations revolved around public officials within these cities. They thought that they were going to have the support. So they thought that the officials would have been in the back pockets of them as opposed to the Zelensky regime, okay? And I do call it a regime in light of all of the opposition, which has been systematically neutralized. What else can we talk about here? There's a big story I want to talk about. I'm going to save that one for last, because it's a bit of a tangent to the usual 24-hour World War III stuff. Angela Merkel's ex-advisor opposes shipping heavy weapons to Ukraine. Now, as I recently indicated, Germany has been snubbed and has been not invited to Kiev because, of course, Germany relies on Russian natural gas and Russian trade in order to keep their economy propped up. And Germany it's stuck between a rock and hard place. You know, they on the one hand need to keep their population fed and need to keep their economy going, but on the other hand, they have their NATO obligations. And so this is why the whole, we're going to send you a bunch of helmets. You guys remember that? And then, of course, the talk has slowly become tougher. Now there's some people within that administration saying that they want to send these Leopard tanks, 50 of them, I believe. And what is that really going to do? I mean, you know, it's really just prolonging the inevitable. You really have to send a much more sizable shipment of supplies to Ukraine in order to fight off the Russians at this point, because they've gutted their command and control, their fuel, their ammo. I mean, they're running low on all these things. And the problem is that all of their tanks and guns require Soviet ammunition. And not a lot of that stuff is manufactured in Ukraine, right? So NATO cannot provide those Soviet calibers and the different types of rounds that are used in the equipment that Ukrainians are accustomed to. You can only get that from Russia. And of course, if their munitions depots and their manufacturing centers are destroyed, then, you know, they have to be all retrained on NATO stuff. To their benefit is that lots of Ukrainian forces, shouldn't say lots, but a portion of them are interoperable with NATO. So they've been trained by NATO, so they can use both NATO forces stuff and Ukrainian forces. But it goes back to that old thing, you know, fear the man with one gun because he knows how to use it. You may know, you know, hypothetically how to use these tools, but unless you've worn it your whole life and broken it in, you probably really don't know how to use it that effectively. Even though some of the technology might be superior, you know, give a guy a good old reliable SKS, and you know, if he's shot that one SKS his entire life, put him up against some newbie with an AR-15 and he's going to win 100 times out of 100. Okay, so before we get into this big story I got to share with you today, this thing that rubbed me the wrong way, this thing that keeps me up at night, we got to talk about this last story. This was sent to me by a subscriber, and this just signifies that maybe there's been foreknowledge of this invasion for a long time, and the powers that be knew this whole thing was coming, and they probably know what's coming 2, 3, 4, 5 years from now. Okay, why a Russian embassy expansion alarmed the Irish government. Now, supposedly, back in 2019, the Russian government wanted to expand their embassy in Ireland, and they rejected it. They rejected the plans to expand it for this reason. The Russians wanted to build a major compound with a major underground subterranean complex. Okay, and this whole thing, they got a picture here. You can go and read the article. It's called, I think I already said it, Why a Russian Embassy Expansion Alarmed the Irish Government. And it just goes into this detail, like they were preparing to potentially use this as some kind of command and control center. Now, this is very significant in light of the enmity between the UK and Russia, and of course, other Northern European countries, right? So we're seeing that the foundations for World War III were being laid a long time ago, and all of these things are just kind of flowering now, or coming to light now. And yeah, the article goes into a lot more depth about, you know, all these unusual architecture and stuff like that they wanted to build there. So anyways, not a very, you know, super important story, but I found it interesting to say the least, and it just adds to the body of evidence that this thing is about to explode in a big way. Now, before I go into this next story, and I've been reluctant to talk about this because, you know, I don't want it to be a contentious issue in the comment section. I don't want it to devolve into debate about whether vaccines are good or not, because I do believe that it's up to you and your medical practitioner what you want to do. I mean, until it's a law that you have to get it, then it's up to you and your medical practitioner, and you should take the advice of people who are certified, accredited, people you trust. Okay, so let's just leave it at that. That is not what really rubbed me the wrong way about this story, because this says more about our compliance with an authoritarian regime than anything else. And it's ironic that this is being pushed when we are supposedly at war with an authoritarian regime, okay? Now, vaccine resistance has its roots in negative childhood experiences, a major study finds. Most people welcome the opportunity to get vaccinated against COVID-19, yet a non-trivial minority did not. Vaccine-resistant people tend to hold strong views and assertively reject conventional medical or public health recommendations. This is puzzling to many, and the issue has become a flashpoint in several countries. You don't say. When we compared the early life histories of those who were vaccine resistant to those who were not, we found many vaccine resistant adults had histories of adverse experiences during childhood, including abuse, maltreatment, deprivation, neglect, and having an alcoholic parent. Basically, if you didn't want to get the jab, you must have been abused or beaten by your dad or had an alcoholic parent or whatever the case might be. These experiences would have made their childhood unpredictable and contributed to a lifelong legacy of mistrust in authorities, as well as seeding the belief that when the proverbial hits the fan, you're on your own. See, that's the sentence that caught me, and this is why I've been squirrel caging on this all day. I'll read that again. These experiences would have made their childhood unpredictable and contributed to a lifelong legacy of mistrust in authorities. When have authorities ever done anything wrong? As well as seeding the belief that when the proverbial hits the fan, you know you are on your own. The reason why this is so perplexing to me, it's not perplexing because, as I'm going to get into, we've been conditioned to accept this kind of thing for a long time. And again, this has nothing, for me, this has nothing less to do with vaccines, and it's more just about general compliance. They are saying that mistrust in authorities is a bad thing, when really authority and institutional authority has been the largest purveyor of atrocity throughout all of history, whether that was religious institutions, corporate institutions, government, police, military dictatorships, communist dictatorships, fascist dictatorships. Authoritarianism is inherently a bad thing. Authority, there's nothing inherently good about authority, and there's nothing inherently bad necessarily either. Systems need various hierarchies, and there needs to be rules. It's not about just, I don't like to follow rules. It's a legacy of mistrust in authority. Well, if history is any teacher, you are fully 100% justified to absolutely mistrust authority. This doesn't mean there should be no criteria for accepting the legitimacy of authority and respecting it where it's due, but you absolutely should distrust authority. Now, this other thing they say, as well as seeding the belief that when the proverbial hits the fan, you're on your own, as if that's a bad thing. Seeding the belief that when the proverbial hits the fan, you're on your own. Because we all know when it hits the fan, the government's going to come to our rescue, right? This is clearly speaking and targeting preppers or people of this ilk, because they know preparedness, survivalism, self-reliance, and the whole self-preservation mindset is starting to gain a real foothold in society. And people are starting to question. The confidence in media is way down compared to what it used to be. I believe in the 70s it was 70-something%. Now it's like 16% or something like that. Don't quote me on that, but it's really low. And so this comes at a time when you have increased austerity, which is going to be rolled out everywhere around the world in the coming 18 months as these food shortages intensify, as the war ratchets up. All of a sudden, not trusting authority is a bad thing. And you should just be unwittingly compliant. You should just always, no matter what contradictory opinions might exist, and I'm not saying that, you shouldn't follow science. I'm pro-science 110%. And when the science comes out to validate certain things. I follow that science, okay? And like I say, I don't want this to devolve into an endless debate in the comment section. Don't waste your time on that shit, guys. If you're just going to do that, go and watch a different video and prep instead. Just focus on your preps. It's concerning to me because not many people realize this, and I have a background in social psychology. I did a BA honors degree in social psych, and I can tell you that the social compliance obedience experiments that were done in the 1960s and 70s, there's something that most people don't understand about those. Now, basically, I should give you some background on what those are. Okay, so you had Stanley Milgram, you had Solomon Asch, you had Philip Zimbardo. They did all these experiments to see how far people would go when coaxed by authority to hurt other people, essentially. Basically, could I get somebody to inflict potentially lethal damage on somebody else? Could I get somebody to kill somebody? That's what they wanted to know, because this is on the heels of World War II and the concentration camps. They wanted to know, how could people commit such atrocities? How could you convince an entire nation of people? You know, something that most people would have thought unthinkable. And I'm not saying everybody partook in that particular part of the thing, but, okay, you get what I'm saying. So in these experiments, which is exactly what they were controlled experiments. People need to understand that the amount of pressure exhibited on these participants is probably not 10% of what it would be in a real world war zone combat situation. So to give you an example, one of these experiments, the Stanley Milgram experiment, found that 50% of people were willing to inflict lethal harm on someone else if they felt that they did not have to take responsibility for the act. And this is not, you know, somebody in a uniform. This is just a guy in a white coat, an experimenter, okay? Now imagine that same kind of scenario, only you have a gun to your head, or you have the military telling you to do something, or you have your government telling you to do something, or your children are starving, or your family is being held for ransom, or you're being told that if you don't do this, just like in the tactics that the communists used to employ, like if you don't, the same thing they employ in North Korea right now, if you run away from North Korea, your family who remains there will get killed. That's how they prevent people from trying to run away. It's like synoptical surveillance. It's like this idea, you have panoptical surveillance where you have an eye in the sky looking down on everyone else. Synoptical surveillance is where we all control one another, which is kind of what we've been doing with the whole technopoly Facebook thing for the longest time, but let's not get into that. So what I'm trying to say is that the reality is much, much worse. Most people, the majority of people, the people that they're not talking about here, are just waiting to take orders. And as sad as it seems, I would venture to say 90 to 99% of people under the right conditions, not because they're psychopaths or anything like that, because obedience, compliance, conformity, all of these social pressures, maybe you have a gun to your head, maybe you're worried about your children, maybe you're worried because you don't have enough food to put in the fridge, or whatever the case might be, most people will commit atrocities under the right conditions. And it's not necessarily because they're inherently evil people or anything like that. It's just the nature of human beings. And that's the scary part. Because this is, in some roundabout way, I understand what they're trying to say. They're trying to say that, you know, people have mental health issues if you don't go and get vaccinated. That's what they're trying to say here, okay? But it's really saying that if you don't conform to authority, you have mental health issues. And I think it was actually a symptom or of a disorder in the DSM, which is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Illnesses, that anti-authoritarianism is an actual disorder. I think it's it's a behavioral disorder in children or something like that. Anyways, authoritarianism is not good. And the problem right now is that we are trying to combat authoritarianism with the whole Russian thing, the China thing, which we kind of seem to ignore throughout all of 2020, which was weird. But we're trying to combat it with more authoritarianism, with more censorship. Like, don't people realize how authoritarianism begets authoritarianism? Like, don't we realize how the more hardline we get, the more authoritarian Putin's going to get? because he has to, because he distrusts his generals, he distrusts all these people, so they have to crack down more and more. And the more we censor them from partaking in us, like, whether it's YouTube or Twitter or whatever the case, banning Russians using these platforms, then the greater the Iron Curtain wall, the thicker it gets, and the less informed we all become about what each other is going through. And authoritarianism begets authoritarianism. So in wartime, authoritarianism, I would venture to say, ratchets up no matter what side you're on. Because, just the conscription and the draft itself is kind of like peak authoritarianism away. Well, not peak authoritarianism, but that's on the pathway to it. Because, the War Act, the War Measures Act, which was enacted, I should say, here throughout 2020 and 2021 when the pandemic was at its peak. Fortunately, they didn't have to tap a lot of those powers that they were afforded under that. So anyways, I'm very concerned about this kind of stuff because we're entering a time when money's going to get tight, when the ability of the police to respond to the crime, which is increasing at a crazy rate. People are stealing copper out of houses. They're stealing the catalytic converters, like anything. They're using sawzalls through the drywall. Like, it's just nuts. The authoritarianism is going to ratchet up, okay? And it's not looking good. So prepare. Do not be convinced. I know I don't have to tell any of you guys this, that, don't conform. Don't obey. Those t-shirts that wear obey? What the hell's up with that?